We can never have the immensity that is time. We can only offer time and invitation.
If you would like to learn about fairy folklore, delve into modern fairy faith spirituality, and explore fun and fanciful fairy-themed events, please subscribe to Fairy Fortunes for new videos every Friday.
Hello, my fair friends. I'm Ruby Ruse, and this is Fairy Fortunes. And today, I am talking about my deep dive into how I use my time. If you're not familiar, part of what I do here on Fairy Fortunes is I explore what it means to be a modern fairy faith practitioner. And a lot of things go into that. And one of the things that I adopted for the year of 2020 within my spiritual practice was the concept of doing a depth year. How I understand a depth year is you spend an entire year focusing on certain elements of your life each month of the year. And the idea is that you're not necessarily bringing in anything new to your life. You are trying to explore what is already in your life, to seek out meaning, to seek out maybe new meanings, and really work through your current practice, system, and self. So here we are in November, and this is my October depth year update. Now, because I am completely obsessed with geomancy, which is the divination system that the Fairy Fortunes divination system was based on, I thought it would be fascinating if I used the 12 houses of geomancy, which are also the 12 houses of astrology, as the inspiration for my monthly themes. So for the month of October, that would place me in the 10th house, which is the house of career. Now, in geomancy, the house of career also governs things like your personal reputation, it governs politics, and it also can relate to motherhood. There are many different correlations that can go to the 10th house. So I didn't have to specifically devote the month of October to career, and I was trying to come up with something that correlated to that 10th house energy. One main complaint I have with my occupation, however, is that I feel that it absorbs a significant amount of my time. Now, most people have a paycheck job that includes 40 hours a week. I had a suspicion that my job actually took a great deal many more hours than that. And so when I started thinking about that, I thought it would be really interesting to take a serious look at not just how much time is devoted to my career, but how am I using my time just in general throughout my life. Now, sitting down and breaking down exactly where you spend every single hour of your waking life can be a pretty overwhelming undertaking. And so I did turn to several tools to help me process all of that information. And one of the things that I used was actually back in 1999, a very good friend of mine had given me the book Take Time for Your Life by Cheryl Richardson, which is a book that is completely devoted to analyzing how you spend your time, and not only that, but also how your past history can affect how you're using time in the present. Additionally, in 2010, I was taking a spirituality class, and one of the assignments was a time tracking system that was inspired by the book The Life Audit by Righton. In the Take Time for Your Life system, the author grouped things together in larger, broad categories. Those included work, spiritual well-being, contribution to others, fun and adventure, emotional and physical well-being, and relationships. And then in the Life Audit, Righton actually came up with some more subcategories of those broad ideas. And so what she was tracking was work, exercise, domestic, leisure, personal, hobbies, social, shopping, travel, and sleep. And what I found very interesting about these categories that these authors use to look at their lives was that I found a lot of similarities to the houses of geomancy, which I mentioned are the houses of astrology as well. And for those of you who are not familiar with those houses, they are: the first house is the self, second is house of money, third is communication, fourth is the house of the home, fifth is the house of pleasure or children, sixth is the house of service, 7 is the house of marriage, 8 is the house of death, 9 is the house of long journeys over water, 10 is house of career, 11 is the house of friends, and last and finally, the 12th house is the house of troubles. But in addition to these 3 systems, which divide human life into these definable categories, I also was reminded of a school project my son brought home from his Montessori school when he was about 6 or 7 years of age. He's a teenager now. And in the Montessori school structure, one of their main assignments that they do is called the fundamental needs, which is a way that Montessori children evaluate other cultures. But one of the first projects that they do with the fundamental needs is that they analyze their own perceptions of those fundamental needs in their own lives. So those of you who are not familiar with the fundamental needs systems, the main categories of that include shelter, food, clothing, transportation, defense, communication, spirituality and religion, culture, and vanity. Now, in some more modern takes on the fundamental needs, they also include things like love and money. So I had all of these different tools to use as categories to think about how I used my time on a daily basis. But for me, some of the categories that those authors had used were just too broad to really help me analyze something specific in my own life. For example, in Take Time for Your Life, there was the broad category of emotional and physical well-being as a one big category. And I knew that for me, that really just wasn't narrow enough to really help me discern some useful information. And then, for example, in the life audit, some of the categories that that author was using were just not things that I found myself doing in my daily life. I really don't spend a lot of time shopping, and so I didn't really want to track time devoted to shopping. That just didn't really have enough meaning for me personally. And because my depth here was so inspired by the 12 houses of geomancy, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be exciting to have 12 categories, and I would track time in each of those 12 categories. But that wasn't really working for me either, because I don't spend a great deal of time thinking about death or doing any activities that related to death. For me, the concepts of death really fell into more of a spirituality for me. So I thought, okay, well, I can take the house of death and lump it into spirituality. Now, another thing is, for example, the house of journeys can relate to travel. Like in the life audit, she was tracking travel. Once again, I don't really do a lot of travel. My where I go to work is actually very close to my home, so the time I spend traveling is really negligible for me personally. But House of Long Journeys Over Water can pertain to magic, it can pertain to divination. So with that in mind, what I came up with for the categories that I was going to track over the month of October were sleep, self, money, communication, home, pleasure, work and service, religion, relationships, trouble, and then I created a category called other to just catch anything that I couldn't really fit into any of those other categories. Now, what I was tracking under communication was largely the work I do here on Fairy Fortunes. I definitely wanted to keep it separate from the occupation that I have because I wanted to keep that house of service and work for my job, because one of the questions that I really had during this time tracking experiment was really how much of my time goes to this job that I feel doesn't meet my values as a person. So Fairy Fortunes had to go into its own category. So I placed it under communication because Fairy Fortunes is not really a hobby for me. I do find it immensely enjoyable, but there's a lot of planning and effort. It's almost a work in and of itself. So I wanted to place it under communication because a large part of the mission of Fairy Fortunes is to teach about fairy faith spirituality, magical practice, and folklore, and getting people to think about things from a different perspective. So I felt that Fairy Fortunes really fell under communication, and that's what I was tracking with communication. Now, I made mention that I excluded the House of Death because I kind of took that category and put it in with spirituality and religion. But I removed also the House of Marriage, which also refers to like work partnerships and platonic partnerships that you might have in your life. But more than a significant friendship, it's a partnership, which is what's under the House of Marriage. But I am not currently married. I don't have a business partner of any kind, and I don't foresee that happening anytime in the near future. So I was able to exclude the House of Marriage, and I just created a category for relationships. Now, what I ended up tracking under the category of other was mostly distractions. So it wasn't really pleasure, it wasn't really a hobby, because that was to me what I was tracking under pleasures was like time devoted to hobbies and maybe taking a walk in the woods and that kind of thing. So for me, that was pleasure. The things like playing games on my telephone or watching TikTok videos. I love TikTok. I'm sorry, but I do. I love it. So I put like all of my distractions under other, and that was really the only thing that I put under the category of other. One of the things I found troubling though in the month of October that I had inadvertently excluded a category pertaining to exercise, which is very disheartening to me because I used to be really passionate about exercise. I had this great physical exercise program that I was doing, and I loved it, and I loved going to the gym. But if you have been following the 2020 Depth Year series, you may have learned that in the month of February, I actually was significantly injured at work, and I was unable to exercise. And then unfortunately, with the state of the world, I never went back to the gym, and so I have not been committed to physical exercise since the month of February. So that's really an unhappy misstep that I made during this. So at the end of October, I collected the data. Now I only was able to do about 3 weeks, so the figure that I'm going to show you is not a complete month. One of the things that I found was that sleep is incredibly important to me. And I really have come to understand after doing this exercise, although I did kind of have a clue about this before this, is that I am one of those people that I need at least 8 hours of sleep every night. Now, in some of the resources that I gave you, I think actually the Life Audit says where you can maybe sacrifice something to gain more time is to sacrifice your sleep. That is just not going to work for me. I am not a functional person if I do not get 8 hours of sleep. On days that I didn't have work, for example, I would often sleep for at least 9 and sometimes 10 hours because I was so overly exhausted from the week of not getting the amount that I required, which was the 8 hours. I am just a better person. I am more prepared. I am more able to cope with my very demanding paycheck job if I get 8 hours of sleep. So that was one thing that was just undeniable in this chart. It seems like a huge chunk of my time is devoted to sleep, but I think actually I could put more in that and be better for it, is that I would actually be able to accomplish more if I devoted even more time to getting the sleep that I need. Something interesting to me was how little time I spent with money. And what I meant by that category is time spent things like paying bills, looking at finances, looking at investments, and this kind of thing. Money was actually something that I enjoyed doing. I actually really enjoy working with numbers and figures. And so money at one time in my life was actually a very enjoyable experience that I really liked devoting some time to. But I was really disappointed that I didn't give myself any time towards that. And so that was just something that I observed over this month in October, where I was looking at where my time went. Now, I was pretty surprised actually with how much little time I actually spent on communications, which I mentioned was largely the work I do on Fairy Fortunes. Now, as much as I love working on Fairy Fortunes and writing scripts and researching projects and things like that, it can get really overwhelming. And actually in the month of October, I fell significantly behind in my videos. I missed a couple of weeks, I think in early October or maybe September or maybe both. It's 2020, it's been a year. So some of the discrepancy in time actually may be a bit skewed for reasons I'll go into a little bit later. But I also had this idea in my head that I spent so much time cooking and cleaning and doing chores that I really didn't think were all that pleasurable to do. And then I was very surprised to find out how much little time actually that I spent doing those types of chores. I'd have to say though, I was really disappointed when I saw truly in black and white how little time I spent with important relationships in my life and also with my spirituality. Now, I talk a lot about spirituality, as you all know, watching Fairy Fortunes on YouTube and visiting me on Facebook and Instagram. But there was a time in my life where I was taking spiritual courses and I was engaging in dialogue with other members of the spiritual community, and I was regularly meditating every day, and I have not been doing that lately. So that could be a product of 2020. But it was pretty disappointing to see those zeros and 1% in those categories. It was kind of sad for me. Now, I mentioned that I came up with this category of other to kind of like catch things that I couldn't really put into one of the other categories that I had designed. And I mentioned that other kind of became like a distraction category. That was where I charted when I was vegging out, if you will, and watching TikTok videos. Really, TikTok is just escapism for me, so it's not really about pleasure for me. And what I thought was interesting is that really, if I was honest with myself, is that I should really get rid of that other category and put it under House of Trouble. Because what I've been finding is that when I need to distract myself, well, when I think I need to distract myself, it's because I'm feeling anxious, it's because I'm feeling lost, it's because I am worried about the state of the world. It was really disconcerting, because if I take the category of troubles and the category of other and really start acknowledging that that other category is really should be in the House of Trouble, that puts it at an amazing 16% of my time goes to worrying and troubles in my life. After the categories of work and sleep, that would mean that troubles is now the most significant percentage. You know, and I'm going to be honest with you, is I was really tempted to put the blame all on my job. In 1 week of work, I worked over 66 hours in 1 week due to the nature of my occupation and the crazy times that we're currently living in. I can appreciate, looking at those numbers, the need to have that time escaping through TikTok, and that time having anxiety, having my sleep disrupted from nightmares. Yes, I had a lot of nightmares in the month of October. The reality is that there are many things that I appreciate about my job. It is so significantly stable. I can't possibly be fired from it. So I'm there until I don't want to be there. So much to some other people's chagrin, I think. There are a lot of things about my job that I really appreciate. And so I really can't put all the blame for all of my problems on my job. I do think that it contributes, but I don't think that that's the whole picture of the problem. As I was analyzing my data and putting this project together in terms that I could talk about and share in a video, I really noticed some consistent themes throughout the tools that I mentioned, the fundamental needs, the houses of geomancy and astrology, the life audit, and take time for your life. I really noticed that all of those tools had some basic universals within them. Things like work, home, and even things like religion and relationships and the self. All of those things are mentioned in many of those systems. In the 4 tools that I use, the 4 different systems that I use to help inspire and create this time log process that I worked on during the month of October, there was only one consistent throughout all of them, and that was pleasure. In Take Time for Your Life, it's called adventure and fun. In the life audit, it's called hobbies. In geomancy, it's called the house of pleasure. And in the fundamental needs, it's listed under vanity. And that's significant, that is the one universal that goes across all 4 of those systems. It's really interesting that society does accept that these are in fact universal basics. everyone knows that at one point or another you're going to have to contribute to society in some shape or form and have some kind of work and occupation. And that's a given. We also know that there is a home life, and then usually there's a spiritual life. Even if you are an atheist, your religion could be your morals and your ethics. What's weird about these basic universal categories of life, how we must devote time to these things, is with the exception of work, I feel like we're told that not only can we live without these other basic universals, is that we should live without them, that they're not a fundamental need, that they're just a want and can be discarded. So you should give up extra hours of sleep because you're lazy if you don't. And you should not be so concerned about yourself and making sure that you're eating and drinking water and exercising and taking care of yourself. And especially that main universal, that one that is consistent through all the tools, the concept of pleasure, is that it is seen as something that you can completely discard, even though it is a fundamental need to human society. Perhaps our societal influences are not in a line with living a full and productive and meaningful life. In the month of October, I mentioned that I had 1 week when I worked a 66 plus hour work week in 1 week. That's a lot. When I finally got a day off, I made a plan and I went to the Morton Arboretum. And I walked and walked and walked and walked for hours in that beautiful place. I felt so good and so rejuvenated, and I felt so much more like myself. So I know that going forward, I really need to give myself some quality time that is not a distraction, that's not an escapism. I have been significantly thinking about departing from my job in the next 2 years, and armed with the information that I collected over this month, where I spent a serious deep dive delving into my own use of time, I could see that that's something that I probably need to make happen. And like I said, I don't necessarily blame my job for all of my problems, but it would be interesting to see what my time would look like away from this particular job. Even though I had to really face some harsh realities when I was faced with the black and white numbers of this time journey, this deep dive into the use of my time, I really found this a very useful and fascinating process. So I am really curious to know if any of you out there have done a similar time tracking project. And I'd want to know what were some of the discoveries that you made on your journey. Please, I hope you'll share some comments down below. If you like this video, I do hope you'll consider checking out the full 2020 Depth Year playlist. The Depth Year process has really become an integral part of my modern fairy faith spirituality. And if you're curious to know more about my practice, I invite for you to look for me on Facebook and on Instagram. On both of those platforms, I offer unique content almost daily. I also have the Fairy Fortunes website. On that, you can access my fortune telling business. I offer very inexpensive readings via email, but I also have many blog posts that continue to talk about fairy folklore, modern fairy faith spirituality, and I list some important fairy themed events. So I do hope that you will check me out on one of those platforms. And with that, have a magical day.